everything else.
How do you've invoked the Iranian people and the Iranian diaspora, I want to get to that in a minute, but you've invoked the Iranian people any number of times. How do you, as a leader of this movement, and have put yourself forward to lead a transition, if not the country, how do you gauge the strength of the opposition to Iran, especially after the so-called 12-day war? It's hard for me to call it 12-day war, it just seems weird. But how, after that, there's been this wave of repression in Iran. So how do you know, sitting here, how strong the opposition is, and how do you know that they can be successful? I guess what I'm asking is, if you think it's strong, how do you think this is going to actually happen?
Well, information certainly gets to us. I mean, there are ways of circumventing the regime's attempt to curtail the ability of people to communicate. Social media has a big role to play in this, but also other challenges that are more safe for certain elements that would be in a position of giving us critical intel on what's happening on the grounds inside Iran, both on the domestic side, I mean the civilian side, as well as the military and paramilitary forces. As a matter of fact, when I announced in a press conference in Paris, I don't exactly know how many months ago it was, but it was within this calendar year. That's where I announced a campaign where we will announce a QR code that people from inside who wish to cooperate or to defect from the regime can connect with us and share with us their information. And in the first few weeks, we had over 60,000 people who applied. I don't know what the number is now. It's probably greater than that. Information, of course, that needs to be vetted and analyzed to make sure that these are actually legitimate people, that we are not being infiltrated or penetrated by double agents. But that's very telling because these are people who would be in the military, in the paramilitary, in the civilian bureaucracy. And the reason it's important is because the whole point of my strategy in this campaign of putting an end to this regime cannot not have a factor of maximum inclusion of elements that can survive regime change. And my default position has been anyone whose hand is not soiled with the blood of the Iranian people should have a possibility of seeing a place for themselves post-regime collapse. We don't want de-Baathification. We don't want that mess. And of course, the Iranian people have the right to seek justice. And they will have their day in court, and those responsible will have to account for their crime. But majority of these people who are not part of this top echelon of the regime that benefits from these arrangements, it's a mafia that's just sucking the blood out of Iran and its resources. Once they're out, those are the people who stand to face the music. Would they rather stand with a sinking ship, or do they think that this is the moment now to join with the resistance and the movement of liberation? And we are providing them an option so they are not in no man's land. That also depends on how the world responds to this phenomenon, because you cannot, on the one hand, ask people to defect and for people to rise if the world is still trying to negotiate yet another deal with this regime or push back or postpone this opportunity. And this window is open right in front of us right now, but it won't last forever. So we have to start calculating whether there needs to be a policy reset from a 4 decades long collective policy of the Western world, America and its European allies included, that has been mostly containment and appeasement, or we need to move to the next level now, because I think this regime has given far more chances to come clean, and they haven't. And how long do we want to kick the can down the road and say, not under my watch? This is really what we're facing right now.
I'm kind of digging the way history is rhyming here. We've gone from cassette tapes in the 70s to QR codes in the first quarter of the 21st century. I was going to ask you about the Iranian diaspora, but you mentioned something a couple of times about Western appeasement. So it's fair to say that you are opposed to a new nuclear agreement should one materialize, or should there be negotiations for a new nuclear agreement?
Well, first, I don't see one coming, and I think we are past that point, because the regime right now is so brittle and so vulnerable that as a last resort, I don't think they will cave in. In fact, they might double down, and they have done that in the past. What leads us to believe that this time they say, mea culpa, now we're going to be good guys? They had ample opportunities to do that. They were offered far better deals than the last offer they had received. We can rewind tape all the way back to the days of Khatami, and they still didn't take it. But the question should be, why didn't take it? It's because the DNA and nature of this regime is such that they cannot coexist in the same sphere of rationality of the world as we know it. Their entire existence depends on exporting this ideology. That was the entire purpose from day one. Khomeini, who then was championed as the person who would liberate Iran by those who led that campaign against the previous regime, could not have imagined what the consequences would be. But if he only had listened to a simple answer that he gave in an interview to a journalist as he was flying back in that 747 Air France Boeing to Tehran, and he was asked after 15 years in exile, what is your feeling returning to Iran? You know what he answered? Nothing. That set the tone of what Khomeini or this Islamic revolution was all about. It was not even about Islam. Because if you ask Iranian clerics today who are not part of the regime, never in our history has that particular faith been so damaged and people turning out from the faith. Right now in Iran, the largest, fastest growing religion is Christianity. We have over 1,500 underground churches in Iran. You all remember, talking about your article, that back then the first exodus of Iranians that were forced to exile were people who were immediately persecuted by the regime because they were Jewish or they were Baha'is and what have you. And yet they came to this country, many of them run this country, but they're dreaming of an opportunity to be able to help Iran again. And how good that would be for Iranians and how good it would be for this country. What stands between that future is this regime that continues to take hostages, that continues to fund whenever they can elements to bring more instability in the region. Bottom line, they are the ultimate problem. The Iranian people know that. Many people in the world are beginning to recognize that. The question is there the political will to do something about it? And that's the part that I'm afraid to say I have seen so far missing. I'm not saying it's going to remain like this all the time, but there needs to be a clearer process of making decisions. And I always remember two eras in history that marked and defined the world as we know it. One was during the Second World War, when you had Roosevelt and you had Churchill. And that combination ultimately put an end to the Third Reich. The second time around was Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. They were able to bring an end to the Soviet Union. And of course, Gorbachev had a role to play in that, agreed. Today, the question is, we are faced with a situation where this very same Iranian regime that the British government tried to appease is stealing drone technology by sending students in British universities to transfer it back to Iran to serve the Russians in their campaign against the Ukraine, just on that front. What would be the prospect of a world where the whole region might be yet again dominated by another kind of superpower that does it in a different way? And I'm talking about China, obviously. Or for that matter, what happens right now in the symbiosis between the Iranian regime and Moscow when it comes to the Ukraine conflict. All of that being a situation where no Western leader has yet to identify the problem and the head of the snake. And so we are trying to appease the biggest culprit that is a reason for all of this instability. And I don't understand at the end of the day what's the rationale behind that formulation of foreign policy. I asked David Cameron when I was in London 2 months ago, why is it that you're not subscribing the IRGC as a terrorist organization? And his answer was, well, our basic thinking and the Foreign Office is we don't want to use our channel of diplomacy, which is our embassy in Tehran. Really? Didn't you use Switzerland as an interim or the Qataris for another reason? Do you really are telling me that you're afraid of subscribing the IRGC just because you don't want to lose a diplomatic channel with the Tehran regime? Come on. But that's one of the problems, among others.